Let's talk about nicotine. Maybe this seems tangential to the work that I normally do, but I promise that nicotine plays a significant role in my life, both in and out of books. Like a few of you watching, I use nicotine, but I consider myself old-fashioned in a sense, because I still smoke cigarettes. Yeah, cigarettes are bad for you, so on and so forth. I know the story already, and I've reckoned with the consequences. All things considered, I prefer smoking cigarettes to vaping, or to whatever Zyn is supposed to be, for a lot of different reasons that we're about to get into. I'm interested in the story of how we as a society moved away from cigarettes, because there were some pretty serious attempts to curb smoking across America when I was a kid, but lots of people picked up vaping when I was a teenager, and now people are getting into Zyn, thanks to relatively widespread propaganda on TikTok. It seems as if the craving for nicotine among the general public never went away, despite looking that way in the 2000s, so maybe it's just changed form, then changed form again. And frankly, if people want nicotine, I think they should just smoke a cigarette. So, let's talk about nicotine. I picked up smoking when I was 20 years old, because why else? My peers were doing it, and I always thought it looked cool, and I'd smoked weed before, so I figured, why not? I've been fortunate to not have nicotine addiction get the best of me, but I still started going down the path of smoking cigarettes regardless. Ever since I've picked it up, I've kept a sharp eye out for how other people use nicotine, and unsurprisingly, a lot of people my age choose vaping. Within the group of friends that got me smoking in the first place, almost all of them vaped, and were undoubtedly in the clutches of a nicotine habit, and so we'd get to talking about it sometimes. Once, I brought up that I'd only just picked up smoking, since I didn't know anyone in high school who smoked or vaped, and they considered me lucky to have not been exposed so early. These friends were a cohort of pretty grungy, queer college punks, myself definitely included, and so one of them was shocked that I didn't smoke as a teenager, and asked me, "None of your friends used Nick? What kind of friends are those?" To which my response was, straight-laced, nerdy gamers, mostly. Which is why my friends didn't smoke in high school. Smoking is a cool thing to do. Like, I still do it because I think it looks cool. And I mostly smoke cigarettes at times where people will be perceiving me so that I can give an impression of coolness to strangers, I guess. But smoking is counterculture. Smoking is queer. Smoking is the most succinct way to demonstrate that you're a badass, that you take risks, that you mean business. And that's always why I've been sort of confused about vaping as a trend. It just doesn't have the same mystique, you know? Whereas a cigarette is cool and edgy, these miniature air conditioning units tell me that you're a fruit in a much more blatant manner, and it even tells me exactly what flavor of fruit you aspire to be. So, I've never really understood vaping in general, but alas, in the late 2010s and through the pandemic, vaping took off as the new teen smoking trend, and that's exactly what got my friends hooked to begin with. From 2011 to 2019, the use of vapes skyrocketed, increasing 1,733% among all high school students, meaning that the percentage of kids who vaped jumped from 1.5% to 27.5% in just 8 years. As well, in 2019, close to 2.9 million children started using e-cigarettes, or nearly 8,000 kids per day. This was an increase from more than 2.2 million in 2018 and close to 2.1 million in 2017. Vaping was absolutely massive, with flavors and packaging that appealed to kids, and in some sense, the statistics show that this was no accident. Eventually, Juul had to stop selling flavors in 2019 and fully remove their products in 2022, specifically because they were popular amongst rebellious teens, and there was no amount of social campaigning that could stem the tide of teen vaping. Now that we have new data on smoking from last year, we know that around 10% of high schoolers still use vapes, which is significantly less than the peak of nearly 30% in 2019, and about on target for anti-smoking campaigns in general. Okay, but the trend of rebellious teenagers who choose to vape is nothing new, and comes as an echo of the spike in teen cigarette smoking that happened in 1997, where the percentage of teens who smoked cigarettes rose to an all-time high of 36%, and has been steadily falling into obscurity ever since. This led to a huge upset in smoking culture, with big tobacco lawsuits making headlines, and making everyone aware of the problem of commercial tobacco being pushed on people, and particularly teens, for profit. Then, in response, ever since 1998, there's been this really prolific anti-teen smoking campaign called the Truth Initiative. And if you grew up watching TV during the 2000s, it's very likely you've seen one of their commercials. For a while, this campaign looked really effective, reducing teen smoking slowly but steadily up until 2014, when vapes hit the market. And, well, you know the story from here. Initially, I was confused at the rise of vaping in retrospect, specifically because there were seemingly successful anti-smoking campaigns and a very real decline in teen smoking ever since that major outbreak in '97. Like, I saw those commercials and I got the message. I figured other kids my age would as well. But, of course, this is deeply naive. Teenagers can be safely assumed to be anti-authority, at least 10 to 30% of them at any given moment, and so that urge to be rebellious and risky and try a drug for the first time never went away. It's thought that teen smoking only saw a downturn because teens just got outpriced from buying cigarettes, essentially, and so once cheap disposable vapes and fruity flavors hit the market, it was basically game over. It was the nicotine craze of the digital age, using digital devices instead of tobacco, paper, and filters, and again, this shit just looks lame to me. I don't know what the fuck to tell you. So there was once a cigarette trend, then a vaping trend a little less than 20 years down the line. But nowadays, though, you can get Zyn, which is supposedly healthier than vaping, more discreet for sure, yet absolutely more sinister than vaping. If you're unfamiliar, Zyns are nicotine pouches that have little in them aside from nicotine salts, additives, and, what do you know, flavorings like citrus, cinnamon, coffee, and various forms of mint.
We have a lot of intriguing flavors, I would say, but I stuck with spearmint.
Let's start off with the facts. Sure, only 2% of teens use nicotine pouches as opposed to the 10% that vape, but that could very well change over the course of 2024, and we simply just don't know it yet. Zyn is currently in the middle of taking off, with celebrity endorsements from none other than Tucker Carlson, who says he uses it every second that he's awake, along with some other whack shit that I don't even want to think about.
I've never had one of my dogs eat a Zyn pouch, though I'm not against it. Because I think they would like it.
And look, I'm not going to get too deep into the rabbit hole of Zynfluencers, because frankly, hunting rightoids is not my forte. But the thing that really bugs me about Zyn is precisely the right-wing bent of it all. This Vox article by Anna North frames it really well. Quote, that hyped-up ethos of Zyn, call it masculinity, in honor of Zyn aficionados' affection for adding Zyn to other words, is part of a larger narrative that's being sold to young American men by tech entrepreneurs like Elon Musk, misogynist influencers like Andrew Tate, hustle gurus on TikTok, and, to some degree, Donald Trump and his loyalists within the Republican Party. While not all of these figures are hyping nicotine pouches, they are pushing some variant of the idea that men can reclaim a lost dominance through hyper-capitalistic, even fascistic, focus on achievement and the perfection of the body. So, Trumpies are popping Zyn and the transgender pundit is mad about it. What else is new? Well, the part that actually gets under my skin is the fact that Zyn is being pushed by Philip Morris, the raid boss of Big Tobacco, the same people who pushed cigarettes on teens to begin with. We've established this chronological rhythm that Zyn came after vapes, which has led to the conclusion that Zyn is the new vaping, but actually, Zyn is the new cigarette. The top search result, and indeed the homepage of the Philip Morris website, displays their new tagline of delivering a smokeless future, and the way they're doing that is by pushing Zyn, although PMI says that they're not asking influencers to do this, so supposedly this is a grassroots movement. PMI acquired Zyn from Swedish Match in 2022, but it's been for sale in the US since 2014. Aha! Like other products that launched around that time, including Juul, it entered the market when the US Food and Drug Administration had few regulations for new tobacco and nicotine products. This whole smokeless future thing is going to rely on the marketing and proliferation of Zyn, and especially because it's affordable, it could end up reaching the teen audience in exactly the same way cigarettes did in the 90s, and the way that vapes did in the 2010s. The affordability, alongside the fact that Zyn is now being intertwined with Ozempic as the newest weight loss trend, quote, content creators are claiming that the $5 doses of flavored nicotine help them lose up to 30 pounds. I have a hunch that despite Zyns being targeted towards beta cuck new males, Zyns could actually catch on with a female demographic for exactly this reason. Something interesting that I found in doing this research is that a larger share of teen girls vape as opposed to teen boys, a ratio that never existed with cigarettes, even to this day. It's likely that the flavor and the more agreeable odor of vaping is more popular for women, and since Zyn has the same qualities, only improved, there could be a contingency of women buyers who are attracted to Zyn not because of the right-wing propaganda, but because it's discreet, or their shit-ass boyfriend uses it and they got hooked that way. Let me be honest, it's not really my mission to curb teen smoking, or to take down Zyn before it becomes the next big thing, because those fish are simply way too big to fry. And besides, who am I to tell rebellious teens to stop smoking? I'm no Puritan. I started out by admitting that I smoke cigarettes, and those are supposedly worse for you than the other nicotine alternatives, so I don't really have ground to stand on, telling other people not to vape or to load an upper decky, or whatever cringe bullshits influencers are saying. Rather, I've taken you down this rabbit hole because I have a vendetta. Simple as, I think vaping looks dumb, and I'll double down for the record. Zyn is cringe and Trump-pilled, and I just don't associate with anyone who uses them. But actually, I have a vendetta against Zyns and vapes because there's a deep literary tradition of using cigarettes as symbols in novels and movies, which is what gives us all of the connotations about cigarettes we understand today, being a badass and all the rest. I try and picture novels of the future that feature characters who vape, or I guess use Zyn, and it's just literally the action of it isn't sexy. It's not symbolic. Like, specifically for Zyn, it's meant to be discreet. And vapes carry no swag and no mystique. It's just a neon box on a lanyard that tells you that the character has a drug problem in the least cool way imaginable. For real, cigarettes have made an appearance in damn near everything that I read or watched this year, where at first it was a ubiquitous piece of set dressing, but once I started picking up on it, it became truly inescapable. Like, okay, I first realized the literary quality of cigarettes from reading this F. Scott Fitzgerald collection, where it's mentioned incessantly because, well, it's F. Scott Fitzgerald, the Roaring Twenties. That was just the culture back then, but it appeared so often that I was like, damn, it's making me want a cigarette right now. So that's exactly what I went and did, smoking a cigarette on the porch at 9:30 p.m., reading this fat-ass Fitzgerald collection. But then I watched the 1985 Clue movie from a friend's recommendation, and of course, the bombshell beauty Miss Scarlet is introduced smoking a cigarette, letting you know that she's a bit of a wild card, a bit dangerous, a bit scandalous, even. A similar sort of characterization happens in My Year of Rest and Relaxation, where the main character, who essentially becomes addicted to sleeping pills, further cements herself as a reckless basket case by smoking cigarettes in between and alongside her drug-induced, often days-long naps. Keeping on with this theme of girls who smoke, Katie O'Brien asks to bum a cig off Kristen Stewart in this year's lesbian thriller Love Lies Bleeding, before the two of them get hate-crimed by a group of dudes for being, well, total dykes. There's no better symbol for the femme fatale than the humble cigarette, an easy way to invite and display danger, a girl who's ready to risk it all, a girl who can face the world with a lighter and a fat mouth. But when I say it was in everything, I mean it was in everything that I've read or watched so far in 2024. It was prominent set dressing in Seijun Suzuki's legendary Branded to Kill, a habit that goes hand in hand with the main character's willingness to do whatever it takes to achieve his goal of becoming the #1 assassin. It's the foregrounding at the very beginning of the equally legendary Slaughterhouse-5 by Kurt Vonnegut, when the narrator says, "I have become an old fart with his memories and his Pall Malls." That was the beginning of my summer reading. Then I read My Year, but then cigarettes also crop up in Alex Smith's Arc Dust, this Afrofuturist short story collection that I mentioned in my second video. And I do want to point out that this novel takes place in an alternate future, where a slew of brand new drugs have come and gone, and ain't nobody vaping, but people still smoke cigarettes. It's simply more literary, and an enduring trope that's still meaningful in speculative fiction. After I started writing this video, I watched the 1989 Heathers movie with Winona Ryder and Christian Slater, and oh my fucking god, the cigarettes are so literary I'm not even joking. Like, in most of these examples, it's kind of tangential, but here, this shit's gotta be on purpose. There's simply no other way. Okay, there's gonna be some spoilers here, so fair warning, but if you somehow haven't seen this movie, go watch it. It's phenomenal. After Veronica and JD meet inside the gas station and share a flirty moment over a slushie, they leave the store and JD lights a cigarette, sitting on his motorbike, which, I mean, this is integral to his character. He's got a badass, loner, weirdo persona. He basically created the archetype in this very shot. Much later, after they've taken care of Kurt and Ram, we see Veronica take up smoking under JD's influence, after a stressful night and waking up in JD's car the morning after. Reflecting on what she's done, Veronica actually turns the car lighter on herself, burning her palm, and JD takes advantage of this by lighting his cig off of her palm, when he should have just used the car lighter that was still hot. This is when we start to get an inkling that JD is actually fully insane, and has a pretty much complete disregard for the pain he puts other people through, very much including the girl that he loves. After Veronica rejects JD's advances multiple times, and after JD tries to convince Veronica to kiss herself, we see JD ominously light a cig on his motorbike outside, before he climbs in her window and puts green heather on the chopping block, before it's revealed that the whole sequence was a dream. The shot of him lighting a cigarette is mirrored when he loads his gun before actually climbing through the window, finding out that Veronica actually did it, and so he lights one in front of her, dangling from the ceiling. I was actually so gagged when I first saw this. I'm so serious. Then, at the very end, JD turns the entire story on its head, asking Veronica, now that you're dead, what are you going to do with your life? And she says, nothing. Pulls a cigarette from her jacket pocket, waits and waits for the fireworks, and walks off in a cloud of smoke. The teen smoking that features in the Heathers movie has a very real function, aside from just simple set dressing. It clues you into motives, incorporates foreshadowing, displays internal thoughts, changes in character, as well as delivering a philosophical argument about the fruitlessness of violence and the results of teenage mistakes. Alongside all these other literary examples, cigarettes are clearly a mainstay of literature, and have been for at least a century, but certainly for much longer into both the past and the future. Cigarettes are the mark of who's counterculture, who's a badass, who's queer, or who's a scumbag punk that you shouldn't get involved with. Cigarettes have a really specific connotation in American literature, and I don't even really need to point that out. Everyone already knows that smoking is sexy and badass, exactly because we've been exposed to these themes through media already, and so, in some sense, I don't even really need to explain all this. It's just common knowledge. So, actually, it might be more important to zoom out a little bit, because tobacco appeared in my readings in more contexts than just cigarettes. I took a course this past semester on Indigenous futurisms, and tobacco, as it's regarded in native contexts, is a completely different story than what's on the surface of American fiction. So, let's take a look into some Indigenous futurisms once again, and learn about a completely different tobacco culture with an entirely different set of literary nuances. The first short story in Chelsea Val's collection, Buffalo is the New Buffalo, is titled Buffalo Bird, a piece of native slipstream fiction that follows Angelique, a shapeshifter and leader in her community, jumping around to different points in her life, from childhood to adolescence and adulthood, and even in her elder years. Before we jump in, I absolutely recommend Buffalo Bird to anyone watching, particularly if Indigenous futurisms piques your interest. So, let's get into it. We find tobacco right away, in the opening paragraph, and I do want to read this to you in order to get an understanding of Chelsea Val's mastery. She found herself on the shore of a vast freshwater lake that seemed to have swallowed up everything before her. The gunmetal sky met quicksilver at the horizon, confusing the eye, blurring boundaries or perhaps merely rejecting them. Instead of sand beneath her feet, there was long prairie grass rasping quietly around her naked thighs, colorless and out of place, stretching behind her for an eternity. Thunder rolled above her head, deep and booming, filling her chest but failing to crack her apart. Reflexively, she pawed at her side, seeking tobacco to light to bolster the strength of the Thunderers as they battled once again, to prevent the world from being destroyed, but her hand found only her own cold flesh. Soon after, we learned that the opening was a dream, where she came face to face with the manifestation of death, unable to summon or communicate with the Thunderers, since she didn't have any tobacco to light. Here, it's not the smoking that matters, or what went wrong. It was the lack of a tool, the tobacco, the smoke being a medium of communication between humans and spirits. See, as you may already be vaguely aware, tobacco has spiritual importance in many Indigenous American cultures, but it isn't meant to be used as a drug the way the wider world understands it. It's imbued with much deeper meaning as a method of communication. The second scene that features tobacco uses it with similar intentions, but in a different context. During a flashback, the main character, Angelique, watches a number of families ford a strong river. They'd already made the worst crossing across the river, with minimal loss of supplies and only a few scary dunkings. She put tobacco down with the others, showing her little sister how to press the dry shredded leaves into the rich river mud. As a part of crossing it, Angelique buries tobacco in the bank of the river, in a way to repatriate or give thanks to it, for cooperating with the people going through it and disturbing the water. This respect for the river, a seemingly non-living thing, demonstrates the Indigenous concept of expanded kinship, which means a lot of different things, but finds that everything that you interact with in nature has a relationship to you, and should be regarded with respect equal to that of another human. This is actually the main point of the story, and the explanation for the title, Buffalo Bird, where, directly following the river crossing, their party finds a herd of buffalo by following the call of the symbiotic bird that feeds on insects in the hide of the buffalo's fur. Angelique makes a connection between them, gazing from afar, saying, "They look like birds, but the buffalo are their real kin." Despite being two very different species, the buffalo and the bird are kin because they work together and provide mutual benefit, and they've made a bond from mutual respect and understanding. The story is titled Buffalo Bird because, if you'll recall, Angelique is a shapeshifter, and her animal form jeopardizes her ability to be accepted by her kin, as she faces ostracism from the Catholic missionaries who've been assigned to assimilate her tribe. See, the central plot of this short story is a murder mystery, where one member of the settlement, Louis, was killed outside in a pig pen, and by the looks of it, he was trampled. Her cousin, Cyprian, brings Angelique out to the scene, and he lights his pipe to start the conversation. Cyprian pulled out a pipe, packed it from his fire bag, and carefully lit a small twig before handing the torch over to her to extinguish. Cupping his hand around the tiny flame, he held it to the pipe and puffed on it until the tobacco was well lit. They discuss the known details, and they share a pipe between them. Cyprian nodded and handed her his pipe. She took a puff and briefly raised the pipe to the sky before handing it back. Okay, so Cyprian is trying to ascertain if Angelique did it, because Louis was trampled, and Angelique has the power to shapeshift into a horse, and she's been known to attack people, primarily the Catholic missionary, so there's some suspicion that Angelique was involved in this attack too, although she knows less information about it than Cyprian does, which is interesting when it's revealed that there's horsehair on the scene. It seems like Angelique transformed, lashed out wildly, and doesn't remember a thing about it, which also explains her dream about coming face to face with death. I want to try and avoid giving spoilers as much as possible, but the final confrontation of Angelique's teenage years is between her, the Catholic missionary, and her community, and a choice needs to be made to essentially decide who is actually kin in the community: the Catholic priest, who is fully human, or the native girl, who is very literally their kin, but is a shapeshifter, and made to look like a freak by that very priest. This is the bottom line of Buffalo Bird. Despite the fact that Angelique is more than human, the community obviously chooses her as kin, even if she takes a different shape, just like the cowbirds, who are kin to the buffalo, despite having wings and being less than a tenth of their size. Okay, I also want to bring an Indigenous movie to your attention, since I've been talking about tobacco in both books and movies. Although less prominent, tobacco plays a role in the stop-motion short film Beat a Bon, directed by Amanda Strong, which is only 20 minutes long, so there's no excuse not to check it out. This beautifully animated tale follows Beat a Bon, an Indigenous two-spirit youth who undertakes ceremonial maple sap harvesting in suburban Ontario, but is rebuked by the panopticon of settler infrastructure, which literally fights back against this Indigenous ceremony. So, in order to collect the sap, Beat a Bon has to drill into the maple, set up tap and buckets, and wait for them to drip. Before doing this invasive yet necessary maneuver, they bury a pouch of what is likely tobacco at the foot of the maple, which is the same sort of offering that Angelique gave to the river in Buffalo Bird, thanking nature for allowing human intervention, giving something in exchange, and building mutual respect. I actually have a ton more to say about Beat a Bon. I wrote a 7-page paper on it back in February, but this video is already massive, and I'd like to keep moving forward. But yeah, go watch Beat a Bon. It's on YouTube, and I post on YouTube, so go and check out my other videos about literature while you're there. Okay, so I should clarify something before we move on much further. The tobacco that's used as part of a ceremony or ritual is completely different from the tobacco that you can find in cigarettes, though obviously, at the end of the day, it's all tobacco. There's a stark difference between traditional and commercial tobacco, whereas traditional tobacco isn't always burned, as we saw in both Buffalo Bird and Beat a Bon, where it's buried, and if it is burned, it's not inhaled. Traditional tobacco can be used as a medicine, or for spiritual purposes, as a way of communicating with and showing thanks to spirits or ancestors, and is ideally grown locally for the express purpose of ceremony. Commercial tobacco, on the other hand, is what we've been talking about during this whole video, up until we started discussing Buffalo and Beat-a-Bon. The distinction is that commercial tobacco is made explicitly for profit and advertised to encourage addiction and create repeat customers through branding and commercials and all of that lovely white people bullshit. While the two contexts of tobacco are very distinct and can easily be kept separate in literature, this is sadly not the case for the real indigenous communities of America. Now, I won't pretend to know all of the specifics, but exactly how this happened isn't a surprise nor a secret. Tobacco was one of, if not the primary export that grew the American economy during the 1700s and 1800s, which was happening concurrently with the genocide of Native Americans. Tobacco was misappropriated in America from the very start, and grown, you guessed it, explicitly for profit, and to be sold overseas, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So, Indigenous Americans were wiped out, moved off their land, and into areas that were less adapted to grow tobacco, and just crops in general, and so traditional, unadulterated tobacco became less and less common over time as a result. Where that leaves us today is that around 60% of tobacco that's used for traditional reasons is loose-leaf commercial tobacco, and that 15% of tobacco that's used for traditional purposes is from cigarettes, or is itself a cigarette. Now, this isn't illegal or blaspheming, but it is somewhat frowned upon, and frankly, it just really sucks seeing native traditions being overrun by commercial interests, especially because cigarette smoking has had such a profound impact on native communities. The data that I'm drawing on is from the Intertribal Council of Michigan, the American Indian Cancer Foundation, and the American Indian Community Tobacco Projects, which shows that just under 60% of all people in these communities that span across Michigan are current cigarette smokers, which is an absolutely massive proportion. This same report finds that 2 out of every 5 American Indian deaths are due to cigarette smoking, leading to the conclusion that smoking is a public health crisis in many indigenous communities, specifically due to systemic inequalities and historical extermination. Simply being an indigenous person in America puts you at a seriously increased risk of death and ill health because of the misuse of tobacco, popularized and spurred on by the colonial misuse of tobacco as a commercial product that is deliberately meant to induce addiction, in the form of cigarettes. What's particularly sinister is that some brands, namely American Spirit, obviously, appropriate Indigenous American iconography in order to sell more cigarettes, under the guise that it is traditional, by means of being organic, or whatever, which is nothing more than a colonizer buzzword. All of this is cyclical, and has a real impact on the very people we took tobacco from, which is ungrateful and conniving and a continuation of colonialism, even if it's niche and not oft considered. Speaking of colonialism, the British and other European powers shipped tobacco all over the globe after it was plundered from the New World, spreading its influence and manipulating it as a commercial powerhouse, getting the previously unacquainted foreign customer base hooked and looking to buy more. For no particular reason, I looked at the influence of cigarettes on China, and I actually trawled up something pretty interesting. Tobacco was introduced to China in the 1500s, but cigarettes came pouring in during the late 1800s, and get this. Quote, immediately after the invention of the cigarette machine in 1881, James B. Duke is reported to have leafed through a world atlas to survey the population of foreign countries. Coming to the figure 43 million, he exclaimed, "That is where we are going to sell cigarettes." The country was China, and in 1890, the Dukes exported the first cigarettes to the populous Asian nation. Using that money, in 1892, James B.'s father, Washington Duke, had helped a Methodist-related institution, Trinity College, relocate to Durham, and a new university built around Trinity was to be the prime beneficiary of the Duke endowment, and the college was rechartered as Duke University, in honor of Washington Duke and his family. I had no idea that Duke University was founded in part by a tobacco magnate, the guy who invented the cigarette machine, and who sold cigarettes to China and made a quick buck doing it. If you went to or currently go to Duke, leave a comment, and please tell me that this is common knowledge, otherwise it should absolutely start being common knowledge. If we take a look where China stands today, 26% of adults aged 15 or older smoke cigarettes, which is more than double what it is in America, and only 11% as of 2021. Adjusted for the global scale, they account for nearly 1/3 of the world's total smokers, and are currently the largest producer and consumer of tobacco in the world. In fact, cigarettes are wildly popular across Asia, and have ingrained themselves as part of local culture and custom over time. My partner's father, who was born in Vietnam, was telling us recently that one of the ways that you can tell that a Vietnamese restaurant in America is legit is whether or not it smells like smoke inside. Or rather, if there's someone actively smoking inside when you walk in. That's how you can tell a place is authentic. He also told us that it used to be customary to offer your friend's parents a cigarette if you went over to their house or something, as a sign of respect. Cigarettes developed into being part of an integral part of social rituals. Ritual here meaning something completely different to the actual Indigenous American traditional ritual, but a ritual nonetheless. It became part of the social structure, a way to express gratitude or respect by literally giving a gift to your elders, which really enforces the philosophical concept of filial piety that undergirds many Eastern cultures. This points to something particularly interesting and inherent to commercial tobacco, because we are still talking commercial tobacco, despite also talking about ritual. In these sorts of contexts, where commercial tobacco becomes central to a cultural ritual of respect, there is an inherent understanding of nicotine as a drug, and of tobacco as a form of currency. Let's continue with Vietnamese tradition, because I've been adjacent to the Vietnamese diaspora for 5 years, so I get the very basics. Okay, so Tet, right? Lunar New Year. You receive money in a little red envelope from your family members as a way to celebrate the New Year, so money is a perfectly acceptable gift in Vietnamese tradition. It follows suit that cigarettes are the perfect gift for everyday occurrences, because they have an inherent value as a drug, but are less valuable individually than the $5 required to buy the pack. See, paying a $5 fee every time to go to your friend's house is basically extortion with a bouncer, but a cig or two is no sweat off your back, and is much more kind as a gesture than it is in direct monetary value. In this way, cigarettes are the perfect sub-nominal token, something that's nice for you to give to someone else, but doesn't hurt you in any way by doing so. So, despite being outwardly harmful, commercial cigarettes can still play a role in society as a token of respect, a piece of your mind, and a way to share love, even though that love will probably lead you to an untimely death. Cigarettes can be part of a culture of respect on the other side of the globe, despite being the leading cause of preventable death basically everywhere, and this is no different in America. I'm a penniless cross-dressing fag, and when I walk through DC at night during my trips into the city from the suburbs, I feel like I'm participating in a similar sort of respect culture, though in a completely different way. I have no money to give to the homeless, but I will always offer a few cigarettes when I'm asked if I have anything to spare, because I can legitimately spare a few cigarettes, and 9 times out of 10, they'll accept them gladly and thank me for giving what I could. In fact, one of my formative experiences as a transgender woman happened because of this exact interaction. I was smoking a cig on the corner of 13th and U Street when a man who had visibly been out on the street for a minute approached me and asked for a cig, to which I replied, "No problem," and handed one over. He had his female companion hovering around him, and she didn't ask for anything, but I offered her one too, and she was happy to accept, and I even provided the light. The man asked me what my name was, and I told him what it was, and he said, "Ah, Opal, you're a real gem. You're a real gem, girl." And I was maybe like 3 months on estrogen? Like, barely starting, no physical changes yet, just in an outfit that was feminine, and it was probably the first time that I was gendered correctly by a stranger. That man disappeared quickly thereafter, but I legitimately started to tear up, because I felt seen and respected, only over a small gesture like handing over a cigarette. I've had other similar experiences, smoking a cig outside of a club and having another person from inside ask for one too, and strike up a conversation for about 5 minutes. It's nice, and it gives me a sense of camaraderie that's missing from my everyday life. This is the real reason why I hate vaping, and why I hate Zyn. You shouldn't share a vape. And yeah, you can share Zyn, but if you pop Zyn, you're probably not going to talk to homeless people, so it's a lost cause anyway. There's no social ritual of going outside, having to wait around until after you finish, and having someone come up to you and join in on your life for a brief moment. You can't give people a perfect subnominal token that works in the stead of money. There's no mutual respect. There's no camaraderie. It's all individualized. It's constant intake that's designed for you to get hooked and stay hooked and to keep buying. There isn't a social subgame to any of it. It's just addiction. That is why I hate new nicotine. It's so digital. like indicative of the digital age, the current moment, when you're incentivized to stay inside and avoid contact with the wider world and do something that only matters to you and to ultimately be a consumerist sheep that plays into viral trends. There's no drug culture, no mutual respect, no connection with strangers, no subnominal gifting. It's impersonal and insensitive, and could very well be equally bad for you, if not worse than smoking cigarettes, but we just don't have the data on long-term use yet. Look, I also want to clarify that there's nothing inherently wrong with drug culture. It's the misuse of a drug that creates a problem, and I think Indigenous Americans are right to point out that commercial tobacco is explicitly promoting misuse. I think that misuse only gets worse when new forms of nicotine get invented, like vaping and zyn, so then we literally have to go back to square zero debating if these things are even harmful in the first place, which, to make a long motherfucking story short, they totally are. Vapes contain toxic metals and thousands of compounds we simply do not know about yet. Zyn contains low levels of ammonia and formaldehyde, and it's very possible we're going to see a rise in tooth decay and tooth loss from people who put their pouches in the same place repeatedly. So, frankly, you're taking a bigger potential risk by using new nicotine than sticking with cigarettes. This isn't a very solid argument, I know, but it's the devil you know versus the devil you don't, right? When we talk about fatalities from cigarettes and how it's the leading cause of preventable death the world over, the implicit part of that statistic is that those people who die are typically smoking in huge excess, like a pack a day or more, so their misuse of commercial tobacco has manifested dire consequences. New nicotine is, in a lot of ways, designed to promote constant usage. Like, literally, that's what Tucker Carlson's testimony about Zyn was, that he uses it from the moment he wakes up to seconds before he goes to sleep, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's convinced other people to follow suit. This becomes doubly sinister when we consider that new nicotine was marketed towards and available for teenagers, people who have no drug education and will absolutely just go ham on these mystery devices and find themselves addicted to it before they know it. Ultimately, drug education is really important, no matter where you stand on this debate, and it's something that I have a passion for, but I'm not an expert. I'm a researcher and an essayist, so what I'm giving you is my opinion, first and foremost. It's not a secret that I smoke cigarettes, but I do it in moderation, never more than one a day, and never at home, so I can go a couple days not having a cigarette at all. I feel like I've cultivated a meaningful and respectful relationship with a drug that can go haywire very quickly, but it's because I read up on nicotine before I started doing it, which is not normal by any stretch of the imagination. What I'm trying to get at with all of this is that new nicotine subverts attempts at drug education because there are so many other factors to consider, and the newness of it all disallows us from understanding new nicotine fully, so we still don't know what to do about it. New nicotine preys on young people and their ignorance in order to get them hooked, and by the time they realize it, it's far too late, and their craving for much higher and much more frequent doses of the drug is going to make it harder for them to quit. If trying to get people to quit is the endgame with cigarettes, blasting vapes and popping Zyns isn't really going to help you. It's true that both of these products were put on the market under the guise that they're to help smokers quit, but all they've done is enable kids to wind up with a nicotine habit before they even know it. I'm not here to convince anyone to quit, all things said, but I think there's an argument for switching away from new nicotine and trying to cultivate a more moderated cigarette culture. Don't get it twisted. Cigarettes are bad for you. End of story. If you don't use nicotine already, it's best not to start. This video shouldn't encourage you to start smoking if you don't already. But cigarettes can have social value, can encourage community, and have the potential to open you up to new experiences. Possibly because I'm biased, clearly, but I think it's going to be easier to encourage a generation of moderation through cigarettes as opposed to vapes and Zyns, because new nicotine is explicitly counteracting moderation at the level of its consumption. I think it's easier to conceptualize only having one cigarette a day, as opposed to a couple puffs of vape a day, for instance. Not to mention, smoking just looks cooler than vaping, and smoking has a literary value that cannot be ignored. Smoking cigarettes is an easy indicator that you're counterculture, so I'd personally like to see more leftist fags smoking cigarettes than blasting vapes, if for no other reason than it's more literarily entwined. It's the same reason why rightoids use Zyn, to feel counterculture or on the cutting edge, but those motherfuckers are not counterculture in any sense of the word, and they can keep theirs in if that's really the symbol they want to pick. I simply think there's more merit in a cigarette, and if anything's been made clear, it's that the young adult craving for nicotine never went away after 1997. It just went dormant and changed forms. So, if you currently vape, consider switching to the acoustic option, and join me outside the club for a cig if you find me. In conclusion, I actually want to leave you with one final literary example, and it's the first moment when cigarettes were glorified in media that I read, and this probably comes as no surprise to many of you, but it was Oscar Wilde's The Portrait of Dorian Gray, which I first read when I was 16. It's in Chapter 6, when Lord Henry, Basil, and Dorian go to the Bristol for dinner before seeing Sybil Vane perform in Romeo and Juliet. At the end of the chapter, the boys are finishing their meal, and Lord Henry is talking in asides to the waiter, asking for some coffee, fine champagne, and some cigarettes, when he stops himself. No, don't mind the cigarettes. I have some. Basil, I can't allow you to smoke cigars. You must have a cigarette. A cigarette is the perfect type of a perfect pleasure. It is exquisite, and it leaves one unsatisfied. What more could you want? Yes, Dorian, you will always be fond of me. I represent to you all the sins you have never had the courage to commit. The characters in Portrait smoke all throughout the book, because it's a gay novel, but this very scene is maybe the most pivotal moment in the entire book, and encapsulates the character dynamic of the trio perfectly, and uses the cigarette as a symbol of ephemeral perfection, which is the central theme of Portrait. A cigarette is the perfect form of a perfect pleasure, because it is perfectly imperfect, a dangerous trap, and a sweet release.